Okay, so I managed to get my 2009 MacBook up and running, which means that I can get a modern shot with almost every camera I've ever used for folding ideas.
Folding Ideas, Patreon, gear video, all of the cameras simultaneously. Take one. I don't even know why I thought this was a good idea. I mean, because like if I've got, it was fine when I had just like all the cameras set up, but then the moment that I added the webcam, it's just like, well, now there's just a MacBook in the way. Like there's no way around it. There's just a MacBook in the way. Okay, so without the laptop in the way, I'm recording. This is just going to be a quick intro. We're recording this right now on 4 different cameras. I'm going to try to be brief because one of them is recording uncompressed RAW. So, in reverse chronological order, we have the Pocket 4K. We have the Blackmagic Micro Cinema camera. We have the Canon EOS 6D. And we have the Canon XF100. So these are the 4 main cameras that I've used over the years. Part of what I was thinking in wanting to do this is that I've never really done a gear video, right? I've never done a video just like talking about my gear and my equipment. And part of that is that I just don't think they're very like interesting for the most part. So I've kind of avoided just here's the gear that I use. Affiliate link in the description. I want to talk about the gear that I've used over the years, but I want to talk about it autobiographically. I want to go through what I've used, why I used it, and why I stopped using it. Because I think in that is not only sort of a story of the channel, but is also a lot of lessons that I've learned and some pitfalls, some like bad purchases that I've made, some decisions that like I thought were going to be cool but wound up just causing me a lot more problems, and then I was looking for a solution to those problems, and that whole process has an impact on the type of stuff that I've shot over the years. It has an impact on the way that I go about framing things. It manifests in the final product in some way, shape, or form. So the first Folding Ideas videos were recorded like this with a laptop. So there's not really a whole lot to say about this. Like, it's pretty straightforward. I had this laptop that I bought in 2009. I spent a few months in Australia in 2010. That's when I was first really like formulating the channel in my mind. And so I shot 2 test videos, only one of which was ever published. And both of them were just shot on the laptop using a webcam. Honestly, as far as like the ergonomics of it go, it was pretty good. Okay, so it's obvious that you're reading off of the screen, but like the screen is kind of right there, right below the webcam. The eye lines, it's not great, but it could be a lot worse. Really, just the thing is that the quality is awful. It looks so bad. But, you know, for just kind of like testing it out, and particularly with something like Folding Ideas, where really it was at the end of the day more about like the content than per se the visuals. Like, I probably could have got away with that for a lot longer. But then I came up with the idea of using the puppet because just at the time, you know, on Blip, I was very much in the orbit of that guy with the glasses and everybody who was involved with that, and they were all moving to Blip. They were all utilizing Blip, and so using Blip was part of the dialect of what became video essay, like what was the review ecosystem at the time. And so I followed along. I played by the script and went with Blip. And also, I mean, working with the puppet in front of the webcam was very difficult. You know, the framing on a webcam, like your ability to manipulate the framing on a webcam is very awkward. And you really can't do anything other than sort of a seated position. Exposure control is very limited. The dynamic range is nothing. It's kind of convenient for one very specific use case. And so I moved away from it super quickly.
Well, suspension of disbelief also extends directly from our assumptions and expectations, which is why the noisy cricket from Men in Black is such a successful absurdist joke. We expect small guns to be weak guns.
So obviously the first mic that I ever used on the channel was just the webcam microphone on my laptop, but that wasn't going to work once I moved over to the Puppet, because if I'm working the Puppet, the mic's up on top of the desk and I'm down below the desk. So the solution that I came up with, the only mic that I had available was the vocal mic for Rock Band. So now that's it's Rock Band branded, but it's a Logitech USB mic. And so I just took that and I took some ribbon that I had. I tied the ribbon around the neck of the microphone and then looped the other end of it just around my neck. And so I had it just hanging like a pendulum mic. And now that's a thing. I feel like it may sound like I was being clever, but the thing is that was just how microphones used to be for a while back in the 60s. It wasn't weird necessarily to watch a talk show where everyone just had these pendant microphones on. But I just I didn't have any other ideas, and I was very much in a position of just use the tools that you've got, use them until they annoy you. And then once they annoy you, once you're frustrated with your equipment, then you actually know what problems you need your equipment to solve. And you can look for equipment that will solve those problems. And so having this weird pendant mic situation, if I moved at all, if I ever leaned forward, it would swing and then bang back. It was just really awkward to wear. It was a pain to set up. And then the mic quality, honestly, it was fine.
The film is ugly, the characters damned and self-damned twice over, and the whole is tinged with a ponderous defeatism. It is difficult and exhausting to watch because what should be the thread that guides us through is treated with derision by the film itself. The subject matter is bleak and it builds only to nothingness. It is a painful film in both construction and content.
It could have been a lot worse. I'm going to say, just as an aside, that a pro of this is that the cable is really long. Okay, so the first microphone that I got was this Apex 415.
The second is Virtual Insanity by Jamiroquai. The song itself is entirely about technology dismantling the future with altered food, destroyed ecosystems, and genetic tampering.
As far as a budget studio microphone goes, this was actually pretty good. And for the most part, at least for the purposes of, studio style of recording, I probably never really truly needed to replace this. My audio has been really bad for a lot of the time that I've been doing this. I guess it's been maybe in some ways better than sort of the standard at the time, but in just revisiting a lot of old videos to remind myself of when I got stuff and when I started using things a certain way, my audio has been a thing that I struggle with. I'm not an audio guy. I know it, I was trained in it, but it isn't the thing that I ever focused on. And it's really the one part of production that I'm constantly feeling I need to, I would really benefit from taking a focused professional level course on, audio finishing, audio recording, all of that stuff. I've never been stellar at it. But, this was it was a pretty good mic. Yeah, we're just gonna move on. So I don't even actually have a copy of the second camera. I don't own it. I never owned it. I had made kind of a handful of videos, And a friend of mine had sort of noticed, and like, I mean, I was posting them to Facebook. A friend had seen that I was doing this and was like, "Oh, do you want to borrow a better camera, like something that isn't a webcam?" And so he lent me his Canon HF S10.
Hey, Cremaster 2 is showing at the Uptown.
These are Canon's, consumer handy cam. It was obviously a lot better than the webcam. It was easier to use, but it was also actually a lot harder to use in some ways. Getting audio into it was really difficult.
Okay, so how this worked is the mic was with me down on the floor, and then that ran via XLR into a little soundboard that I don't own anymore. And then it ran from the soundboard to the camera via TRS, 3.5 millimeter TRS. But then on top of that, like the soundboard needed power and the camera needed AC power. And so there was a lot of cables everywhere. It worked, but there were a lot of cables.
Independently of the fact that it was better than the webcam, that was a terrible camera to use. It's a consumer handy cam. It's not really meant for recording staged stuff. It's not really meant for like piping in external audio. So there were a lot of complications with it. Autofocus was a big problem. Auto exposure was like a thing that I needed to deal with a lot and fought against a lot. But it was good, and it was a loaner. And eventually he wanted it back. And then I still didn't return it for a while afterwards until I could finally afford, a camcorder of my own. So that brings me to my first real camera, which is the Canon XF100. I bought this in April 2012. The first video that it was used on was the dark side of source code. This cost me about, I think, $2,800, $3,000, something kind of, I think it was like just south of $3,000. This was a huge jump up. It's a full 1080 camera, proper 1080 camera, 24p as an option. It is an interlaced camera by default though, so there are some behavioral quirks with it. This was actually a really good camera, and I've pulled this out a few times recently this year to use it. We brought it with us on the Vegas trip for This Is Financial Advice to shoot a bunch of BTS stuff, and it was almost this moment of like, oh, this is what the Canon 5D took from us. This is the future we were promised. Something about like the camcorder ergonomics are a thing that we have like lost, and I think that camera technology is all the worse as a result of that. The form factor is actually really good. Like holding a camera like this, having, these like having the zoom controls up at the top, the integrated lens, I think to a degree, maybe we fixate a little bit too much on swappable lenses as a feature over just like a really good integrated lens. There's things you can do with an integrated lens that are very, very expensive to do with swappable lenses.
Yeah, I say all that, but then one of the main reasons why I don't use this anymore is because of a scratch on the front lens that is effectively irreparable because the lens can't be swapped. And that scratch definitely shows up in footage. Here it is, and here it is again, and here it is again, and here it is again.
But aside from that, it's a very convenient camera. You've got a lot of your controls are in really like good spots. It's easy to use, it's convenient to use. And honestly, like looking at the footage that I can get out of it today, like it definitely looks like a dated video camera. It looks like a dated camcorder, but it doesn't look like that dated, especially in a controlled space. It shows a lot more when you're like outside and you need to deal with extremes of brightness. It does not handle
extremes very well, but in a controlled environment, the image out of this still looks pretty good. And in retrospect, I do sort of regret that I didn't use this as long as I could have. By the time I stopped using this, I had moved into doing corporate videography, freelance corporate videography, and so there was a pressure to look the way that clients expected footage to look. And unless you were recording like really long stuff with sort of low quality expectations, if you were recording anything kind of promotional, anything really image based, and I mean that in terms of like corporate image is also just like visual, anything that entwined to those, your stuff had to look a certain way, and that was going to dictate the kind of equipment that you were bringing to the job. So I do kind of regret that I didn't use this as long as I did, but you know, it sort of made sense as to why I stopped using it. So I used this from 2012 through about 2015. Okay, so the first bunch of videos were really just made with like a desk lamp or whatever practical lighting I had around my house. Then in 2012, I finally got my first set of like production lights. I don't actually know exactly when I got them. I just know that the box for one of them is in the video where I'm building the version of Foldy that's made out of foam core, and so I had them by that point. But so my first production lights were these Lowell Toda and Pro. So these two as a kit. This is a floodlight. This is it was a Fresnel. It was a little mini Fresnel. The lens broke. I was using it on a job. It was winter. We brought it in from like it had been on for an extended period of time out in the cold. It got turned off while it was still out in the cold. Like it was like minus 30, minus 40 outside, and it just the glass cracked in the cold. The advantages of these are quartz halogen. Obviously, like relative to the amount of illumination that you get out of these are still like compact. Even today, this is still compact. Now, why would I stop using these? Heat and electricity. So the downside of these lights is that you need to be very, very careful about how many of them you put on a single circuit, because you can overload a circuit, like a household circuit, very, very quickly with these styles of lights. And they also get very, very, very hot. This one, you can actually, so on this heat guard, a clothes peg lit on fire and scorched it. So there's still evidence of what heat can do. Never obstruct ventilation or use closer than 5 feet. So you need 1.5 meters of clearance in front of this thing for heat purposes. The other thing is they are tungsten balanced. Obviously, they're tungsten lamps, so that's tungsten balanced. You know, if it weren't for the heat issue and the power draw issue, like if it weren't for the fact that these will trip breakers if you're not careful with them, you know, I'd probably still use at least this one. This one, like this is still like, aside from the fact that it's tungsten balanced, it's still a pretty good floodlight. This one just was never very good to begin with. So these start showing up. These don't really show up in force in the videos until after I got the XF100. That's kind of when like it's the first videos that actually kind of look watchable is at that point when I've got proper lights, I've got a proper camera. It is bright enough though. I mean, getting a 160. That's twice as bright, and it's at a quarter power. Okay, so in 2014, my sister was working at Canon. She had a job with the company, and so I was able to get the employee discount. And I bought my first DSLR, the entry full frame, professional full frame EOS 6D. I bought this first and foremost for photography, for personal photography, though video was also part of that, because by 2014 the DSLR look in corporate video, in kind of freelance video, like it was the style at the time, and everybody was sort of expecting it, and everybody was expecting things to like look a certain way. And undeniably, like, even though they're both 1080p cameras, undeniably the 6D has kind of a better textured look. It handles fine detail better, in part because it's actually a higher than HD sensor, and so it's downsampling, and so you get smoother sharpness, you get better sharpness. The photo processors in, like, so the DSLRs kind of took over, because the DSLR cameras prioritize image in a way that the broadcast camcorders don't. But the first video that I used the 6D on was the Transformers 4 vlog in June 2014. And then it got used sort of a handful of times as a B cam. So right around the time that I got onto that guy with the glasses, like that I was formally brought on board with Channel Awesome, I recorded like an intro video. I recycled a couple of videos and just sort of added new intros to them, where like I talked to camera to sort of contextualize the video. And so I would have like the XF, and then I had this as like a B cam getting a second angle. And so it was used a couple times before I wound up making it the A cam that I was using all the time. Image-wise, I think this still looks fantastic. Usability-wise, there are a lot of problems with this form factor. Monitoring this camera as a self-shooter is an absolute nightmare. Focusing on it in video mode is terrible. There isn't even like a punch in, so so unless you're using a parfocal lens, like you can't even like zoom in and whatnot. It kind of was like, I mean, it's a DSLR, it's an electronic photo camera. It really is built around like autofocus, and the autofocus in this isn't bad, but it doesn't have like face tracking autofocus, though incidentally the XF100 does. Also, as a photo camera, in order to avoid certain types of tariffs, this has a record limiter, so it can't record longer than, I think, like 23 minutes. So you can't do a take longer than 23 minutes. For corporate videography, for the most part, that's fine. You're rarely going to be going over that, and anything that you were going to be going over that limit on was probably going to be something like a conference, and you would just bring a completely different style of camera. You'd bring like a C100 or something. So I used this for a whole bunch of videos, but they have a very distinct look to them, in part because I was playing around with lighting at the time, but also just because it doesn't handle magenta well. Some of that's on me and how I lit things and the lights that I had available to me. And some of it was just like a stylistic choice that I just don't think has like aged very well. Those videos, like, I feel like they're very distinct. They're very noticeable in the back catalog. I spot them and it's like, that's one of the ones that was shot on the 6D. So that was the 6D. So that's 2014, late 2014 through 2015. So one of the benefits of the XF100 is that it has all of its like integrated audio. And one of the problems with the 6D and other DSLR style
cameras is they don't have integrated audio. They don't have XLR ports, and their onboard audio is terrible and unusable. And in the case of the 6D, if you're using an electronic lens, you can hear it making constant micro adjustments, like it goes through the body of the camera, and so you can just hear it constantly going like, and it's bad. It's terrible. But so as I was moving into DSLR shooting, I needed an audio solution. And so I picked up this Tascam DR60D. And in terms of cost benefit, the $200 that I spent on this, which I agonized over because I had just spent like a whole bunch of money on a camera, and I had just bought like lights and stuff like that right around the time I was just like, can I afford it? Can I justify it? And I absolutely could justify it, because in terms of like value, this is some of the best money I've ever spent on the channel. This is actually probably the only piece of gear I have that I could properly say it paid itself off, because I did end up actually renting this out a few times just to friends who were like, hey, we just need an audio recorder for the weekend. We'll give you $25. We'll give you $75 or something like that. So just friends giving me like $25-$50 to rent this for like a weekend or a week. It's only $200. It pays itself off super fast if you actually bother to do that. It was also just like really good. So it was inexpensive. The quality for the cost was like really good. You can see that even though it's a budget option, there's still very like considered design to it. It's got the handles which serve to protect the buttons and switches and all of that, like if it happens to fall onto its face. It has the over under thing, which you can do really tacky things with. You can stack this up with a DSLR and then put a mic on top of that and call yourself Technomancer Skeletor. You can be cringe. I do find that using the over-under stack, I don't particularly like it. It raises the center of gravity on the rig too high, and they're not quite stable enough. Now this one is, I don't want to say heavily modified it, but I've made a couple clear modifications to it. There are some Velcro straps on the back that were paired with Velcro on an external battery. And then just a piece of cork on the bottom to keep it from slipping, because the base of it was just it's this really hard plastic, this really slippery hard plastic. Even though it's textured, a lot of the like tripod plates and stuff that I would put it on, if I wanted to mount it on rails in particular, because those don't have like a grip surface to them, it would slide really easily. It was hard for it to get grip. So I put some cork on the bottom to give it a grip surface. I put Velcro on the back in order to attach a battery, because the downside of this thing is that it is really not like power efficient, at least as far as my needs were concerned. So the thing that I need in an audio recorder is I need like all day recording, because the thing that I like to do, or the thing that I have the habit of doing, is I turn my stuff on and then I'm in and out of the room kind of all day. I'll record a little bit, I'll go take a break. I'll record a little bit, I'll go fact check something. I'll record a little bit, I'll dump the footage just to make sure that it like looks good and whatnot. And if you're doing that, you'll go through the double A's that are in this quite quickly. Like they only last, 3-4 hours of sort of idling, like 2 hours of recording. And so if you're on a job, like if I was doing corporate stuff, the double A's would usually last just fine, because you would put fresh pairs in, you'd put a fresh pair in kind of like right at the start of the day, and then you would just like work, and they would probably be dead at the end of the day. and that would be fine, and you would just get rid of them. But needing to kind of remember to like turn it on, turn it off, like turn it off while you're not using it. I would find far too often that I would get halfway through a 40-minute recording session, 60-minute recording session, hour and a half recording session, and it would just like die on me by surprise. So I had a battery extension, just a cell phone charger style battery, because this uses, so for AC it uses USB. So this was actually like great. You could just use any off the shelf USB battery as a battery extension for it. Very cost efficient battery extension. So if you're on a budget, like that was like the go-to thing. Like that was like really cool. So around 2014, I was working freelance. I needed a shotgun mic for, corporate style interviews. They're not gonna, this isn't gonna be appropriate for that. So the first mic that I picked up was, okay, so the fact that this like Apex 415, so Apex is a budget brand, right? Like they're the cheap stuff that you pick up because you really can't afford the real version. So they're the cheap clones. They're the cheap clones of famous better mics. And in this case, it was fine. Like the mic was okay. It was perfectly serviceable. So I had maybe a misplaced faith in the quality of Apex relative to their competitors. And so I picked up an Apex 175 shotgun mic and instantly regretted it. But I almost instantly went out and replaced it with a Rode NTG2, which is a workhorse microphone. It's an industry standard, documentary work, corporate videography, and it wasn't even that much more expensive than the Apex, and that microphone I have been using ever since. It's a fantastic mic. It's durable. It's very high value microphone. So I've just kept using that one ever since. That's dusty. So in the summer of 2014, I finally got an LED light, which is this one. I wound up getting a second one of these a little bit later, like 4 or 5 months later. But so these are a Nanguang CN600 SA. These are cheap. I want to say that this was like $120, $150, something like that, which really is like not that much for a thing. It's a lot cheaper, or it's a lot more expensive than just using a household lamp. But as far as like professional fixtures go, it's really inexpensive. Now, I will say that these meet like kind of minimum usability standards. They've got the built-in barn doors. They are like reasonably bright for their cost, and they are easier to soften up than a lot of like hot tungsten lamps. So you can put diffusion on this a lot more easily, and because it has the built-in barn doors, you can put it out, but that cuts the light. They're reasonably bright for their cost, but they're not that bright. So there's two big issues with this. One is durability, which is like this one's already like basically broken. The
the LEDs on it will sometimes only half of them will light up and the other half will stay dark. And sometimes that second half will like just turn on a while later. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes if you turn it off, turn it back on a few times, it'll sort itself out. But, that's just a durability issue. They wear out very quickly. The second is just a general, I guess it's all quality, but I mean like the quality of the light. These crosshatch like monsters, even if you there's an insert that you can put in that like softens it up and takes care of like a lot of the cross hatching, but far from all of the cross hatching. So while I was using these, I was very limited in terms of like the field of view that I could use on this back wall, because you couldn't get the lights far enough away in order to get the cross hatching really like off screen. So it would have to be pretty tight. Like I would have to frame up pretty tight in order to avoid having this wall have a bunch of like very harsh, ugly crosshatch gradients on it out towards the edges. And like as you would get like anytime like you would use it to like cast shadows on the wall, it would look terrible. But again, I've got 2 of these. I still use them on occasion. They do have the advantage of being still like quite light, and unlike the tungsten lamps, they could be pointed straight down without really having a heat issue. And they've got a built-in yoke. They are like reasonably sturdy mechanically. They're just cheap electronics. So I keep them around. One of them still works mostly fine. Yeah. But they did good, at least as far as like what I needed them for, right? Like, so if I say they only lasted about 2 years, which I think they actually lasted a little longer than that. Honestly, like closer to 6. Okay, so fact checking this in post. For the Aliens Fourth Wall Break, July 22nd, 2015, if we look at the reflection in my glasses, we see the umbrella diffuser from the Toda light. But then, a month later, August 21st, for the video We the Audience, the reflection is now square. Also, I counted, and they lasted 4.5 years. Okay, so that brings me to possibly one of my favorite cameras of all time, the Blackmagic Micro Cinema camera. I adore this thing still to this day. Its design, its shape, there are certain things about its usability that are just a delight. In fact, it got some things right that I really wish that Blackmagic would go back to. You have the exposed SD card bay, which makes it really just like convenient to use. Like there's good ergonomics with that. The exposed battery, and the look out of it is just, it's really, really good. And having a camera this light, this compact was great. Unfortunately, to get it this compact, to get it the size of a baseball, comes with some trade-offs. And so the big thing is that this camera has no monitor. And so really you have to run this camera as part of a system. Now, as somebody who for the channel was largely doing self-shooting, I didn't really consider that to be a downside because I'm gonna need to use a forward-facing monitor anyway. So this was intended to be paired with a second device, the Blackmagic Video Assist, which I have and which is my monitor right now. So it's currently in use, showing me what my camera is seeing. But that adds a certain... It makes the package cumbersome. It means that the thing isn't usable outside of sort of built-up configurations. But I was very much willing to deal with this. Now, I actually have 2 of these. This one is semi-broken. Unfortunately, I fried the HDMI port on it by creating a ground loop with a battery. I had plugged the video assist and it into the same battery, and I did it in the wrong order, and so it created a ground loop and fried the HDMI port. And so I had to go get a second one very quickly before we left for New Zealand to shoot the Hobbit documentary with Lindsay. So this was the camera that I brought on that. Well, so one of the things that really improves this over the 6D, like there's two main things. One is that this will shoot, okay, it has the capability of shooting RAW, but that's sort of the thing that like, that's the tech obsession that sort of like lures you in. You're not actually going to shoot RAW on this all that often, but it does shoot ProRes directly in camera, and working with ProRes from an editing standpoint is just such an improvement over working with H.264. So that's one of the downsides of the 6D. I shouldn't say it as a downside of the 6D. So this improves. So the notable improvements over the 6D and the reason why I got it. So it shoots in ProRes. It shoots in an edit-ready codec, which is just, it's a higher bit rate. It's better for editing. It's able to have a much higher dynamic range. It also doesn't have a record limiter. So you can record as long as you want, which means that for recording very long videos like the 50 Shades videos, yeah. So kind of going back to like, well, the XF also doesn't have a record limiter. You could have just kept using that. But I really, really don't regret moving to this. This was also like a very inexpensive camera. I think it was about $1,200 Canadian. So the first one that this showed up in, the first one that I used a micro on would be the Bloodborne video in April 2016. I still really like this thing. I am very sad that this one's broken. And that my other one at the back there, which does still work, is starting to wear out in some ways. They are unfortunately proving to not be like the most long-term durable cameras, but I've also put like tons and tons and tons of hours on them. And unfortunately, like they can't really be readily replaced anymore. They're not being manufactured, and Blackmagic hasn't produced a direct modernization of them. But as a Super 16 sensor camera, yeah, it's just fantastic. Now, it created a whole bunch of like trouble for me in terms of lenses and whatnot. I wound up moving basically just to like manual lenses because I couldn't afford electronic lenses that worked with it. Also, with the Micro Four Thirds mount, I just did not like a lot of the electronic lenses that were available in the mount. And I kind of had, I don't know, this like idea. I kept buying like EF lenses that I would then like adapt down in sort of this like, oh, well, I'll probably get an EF mount camera in the future when I can afford one. And that didn't happen. So this has been used on a lot of videos. I really started working hard to develop like style, especially once I had access to a camera that I could like grade. A real downside of the earlier cameras, the XF100, the the 6D, kind of what you get out of them really is what you get. You can do very sort of limited things with the image before it just starts like falling apart, and that'll be even like on your editing suite before you put it on YouTube. And so once it gets on YouTube, it's just going to be like all of the problems are just going to be massively compounded. But I love this camera. I really wish that there were like a newer version of it, I guess. fantastic little baseball, even if it is like really annoying to use in a lot of ways. So then in March 2019, I moved to this camera, the Blackmagic Pocket 4K. Now, I do also have two of these. That is a consequence of a similar thing. I created a ground loop and fried the HDMI port. So this one is mostly functional. It does not have a functioning monitor output. Now, in this case, because the back screen still works, this camera is still in a lot of ways fully functional. So I continued to deal with the just frustration of not having a forward-facing monitor until I was headed to New York to shoot Line Goes Up. And just with like how much time and effort and energy I had put into kind of preparing everything for that, I just figured that it wasn't worth the risk or the hassle of not being able to, have a forward-facing monitor for that shoot. And the stuff in front of the graffiti, I just felt like I was putting so much on it that it wasn't worth the risk of not having a fully functional camera. And so I went out and picked up a new body. And actually, this one was broken in a couple other ways. I actually got it. These were really hard to get when they first came out, so I got a refurb. So a couple of the switches on the top, or a couple of the controls on the top have never worked the entire time that I've had it, because I bought it basically pre-broken, and then I broke the HDMI port. And so this one, it just, for the most part, it just kind of sits. I don't want to say it sits around. I keep it on hand because it's not rigged up in a cage with rails and focus assist and cables and a top handle and all of that. So if I need to do anything on a gimbal, it's quick. It's kind of my second body, as a backup, as a just in case if I'm shooting, something that I really want to be more time efficient with, and I need to shoot two cameras at once, then I've got the second on hand. But by and large, I've got two of this body because this one broke. So all the macro shots I've been doing lately, I've been doing using the second body, because that whole thing that requires. So I've got a copy stand. The copy stand has a weight limit, so you do want a pretty stripped down camera for that. But this has been a really good camera. I've been using this camera ever since. So the first video that this showed up in was Fortnite, for the very brief 2-camera segment at the start of that video, and functionally everything since. So ultimately it's been a very good camera for me. It comes with a lot of ergonomic issues. It started eating my SD cards, and so I needed to get CFast 2 cards. And that was very, very strange. It was just, I would put them in, from putting them in and taking them out, something down inside the slot was just gripping too tightly, and all of my SD cards started cracking at the end. And so I moved to CFast cards. CFast also meant that I could, up the quality settings even higher, because I was shooting principally in Super 16 mode. Now, that was a decision that I made that was, in a lot of ways, driven by kind of a aesthetic fetishism that I had fallen into. I don't necessarily regret it, because I think that there are some things about the ergonomics of Super 16 that reflect in the finished product in a really interesting way. There are characteristics of lenses made for Super 16 that are quite distinct. I didn't get to really take advantage of any of those. And so one of the things with the Micro that's a real sort of challenge with it as a Super 16 camera is that getting a good wide angle lens is really troublesome. Okay, so I just spent 2 days looking for a lens that was inside the lens case the whole time. I do have a wide angle lens for this camera. I have a 7.5 millimeter Rokinon that I've used in a whole bunch of like vlog footage. But then that lens is too awkward to, like, it's not built to take a filter. And so you can't really shoot outside with it without just like stopping it all the way down. And so it's not the greatest. It's not the greatest. It's not a great way of doing things. That footage, I think, looks kind of like butt. The Pocket 4K, it has a slightly larger sensor. So your sort of midpoint on a lens, your neutral lens is going to be a little bit different. If you're shooting at the full size, then it's 24 millimeters instead of 16, which means that if you have a 16 millimeter lens, which I do because that was the default lens that I was using on Super 16, then you have a wide. And if you have something like an 8 millimeter, then you have an ultra wide fisheye, rather than needing to go with a fisheye lens just to kind of get something a little bit wider. So I don't really regret it. I've worked the hell out of these cameras. They've been really good to me, and there's a few things about them that I do still chafe against when I've been shooting, particularly as I've been shooting more and more stuff outdoors where I have to rely very heavily on ND filters. So I have been slowly debating, like, what am I going to do? Quality wise, this is more than I could ever need. Like, the 4K out of this looks fantastic. It fits well into 90% of the things that I do. There's not a lot of reason to really like move past this, but there's like a handful of things that I'm finding that I need like solutions to. So that's the Pocket 4K. So that's what I'm using these days, is a Pocket 4K. And I think it looks good. Yeah. So then in late 2019, I went on Kijiji and I found a pair, like a studio pair of Kino Flow Diva lights, which are kind of a bit of a classic. Like they have a bit of a mixed reputation, and I knew that at the time, but I bought them anyway. I got a pretty good deal on them. It was still like $2,000 used, but it was two fixtures plus ballast, well, the ballast is integrated, plus lamps, plus stands, plus a rolling case. And so that was basically like a little more than 50% off of what you would have paid more than double that if you had bought that kit new, back when it originally came out. Now, the Diva lights are a little bit notorious, because of a couple things. One, the tungsten balanced lights in the kit are awful, and you should use them only as a last resort. Two, the lights take forever to get up to color temperature, and they warm up so gradually that if you're not paying attention, you won't see it until you're going back through your footage and you're trying to like match shots that were like an hour apart, and you're just like, they just look different.
All right, the light's nowhere near temp, but it's midnight. I want to get this done with.
So they were very slow to get up to temperature, and they were also like relatively weak in terms of the intensity, which for my needs in this space, they were pretty much fine. But it was like at full brightness, they were as bright as I needed it in this room. And so if you were working in like any kind of bigger space, they were like really underpowered. You couldn't you really couldn't like adequately light a room-sized set with them. So that's kind of a little bit of sort of a split kind of issue. Like I guess that's really sort of getting into the weeds about like how bright a light can or should or like needs to be in order to be considered useful, because they were comparably bright to those LED panels. Downside from the LED panels, they were substantially heavier than the LED panels, so they're a little bit less flexible in that regard. But and part of it is just because they're bigger, because they're like, you know, they're a couple feet long. They've got a larger ballast on the back. But they are like nice and fully integrated. And if you're like, and the thing about them, like they were worth the trouble. Even like, so the reason why they're a bit notorious and not just a flop is because when used correctly, like they looked great. You know, they gave you like exactly the kind of, you know, if you wanted that sort of like soft diva light, for making an actor or an interview subject like look really good, without a whole lot of extra work manipulating the light itself. Like you got that just right out of the box with those. And again, like sort of on the brightness thing, like the fact that they just couldn't go sort of obnoxiously bright made them really like mellow. You know, you could put them like pretty close to talent, without them like blinding, or anything. So in that regard, like they were quite usable. The problem with them, at least like from my use, and the reason why I got rid of them, is that they're just kind of a ticking time bomb. So you can't get the replacement lamps anymore, and there were like LED replacement lamps, but they were very, very expensive and very, very difficult to track down and rarely in stock. So that was the big thing, is that I couldn't even convert them to LED. And so I was just looking long term, and it was like, you know what, these are going to eventually break. You are eventually going to run out of lamps. You are going to need to replace these long term. And so I just, I spent a lot of time looking for sort of options about what to do with them, and wound up replacing them in early-ish 2023. Oh man, I'm not even sure on the time that. I'm going to need to go check the time. But so the fate of my Diva lights, the reason I don't have them anymore, the whole kit, like I was going to replace them, and the whole kit, like it was very bulky. It was the size, like it's half the size of a refrigerator, basically. You know, it was quite a large case. They are rather bulky fixtures. And so I donated the set to the Calgary Society of Independent Filmmakers, and they were then able to take that kit. So they were able to take my kit and their Diva kit and kind of like merge the two of them into one really well-stocked kit. Whereas like, because I had one that was kind of on the edge, they had one that was kind of on the edge. Merge the two together, you get one like actually pretty good kit in really good condition, and so they're going to use that until its end of life, and that's, I think, a good, I think that's a good place for that to go. The reason why I stopped using this is, as with a lot of other things, because it broke. I had this little pigtail USB cord going just like from the battery into the device. You know, it was only about like that long, and just like that. But it means you have this USB cord sticking out of the side. So one day I set it down, I go to do something, and my cat hops up next to it and knocks it off
of the, like, I had it on like an ottoman or something, like, you know, a footrest. And she knocks it off and it lands on the plug. So landing on the plug pushed the USB port into the body and snapped it off its leads, or at least partially snapped it off its leads. Now, at first I was like, okay, I can probably fix that. But the internals of this thing are a mess. And the really, really unfortunate downside is that, so to get to that, to get to the USB socket on the inside of the device, you need to functionally fully disassemble it. So I considered repairing it, and it was just like, no, you got to tear the entire thing apart. And I'm just like, no, I don't want to do that. So I looked at a couple other solutions. I looked at just like modifying the power supply, and that was going to be sort of a whole thing because it has sort of a weird power regulator. And so I wound up running it, just churning through AA batteries for a bit, when I decided I was tired of that. I was tired of constantly replacing batteries. I was tired of that. And there's this new technology, semi-new technology. There's this technology that's been around for like quite a while, but is finally making it into devices, and that is 32-bit float audio, which is an extremely high bit rate, which allows for devices that, if you build a device with dual gain, you can have an analog spread where basically you can eliminate the possibility of clipping. You can just have this like truly enormous dynamic range that makes your audio extremely flexible, which, you know, is maybe not actually that big of a value proposition to a dedicated location sound recordist who, you know, has their headphones on and like is managing all of the audio live. But for someone who is self-recording, who kind of needs to be able to like set it and forget it, amazing, life-changing even. But so I was hearing a lot about 32-bit float audio. You know, I was seeing a lot of gear videos on YouTube that were like, 32-bit audio, is it everything it's hyped up to be? How are these new devices? And I decided that, like, you know what, let's maybe be a little bit cutting edge. I on kind of a whim, because I was like just annoyed at this thing being broken, went out and picked up this one over here, a Zoom F6, which has 32-bit float. Yeah, it turns out the 32-bit float is the hype is real. It's it's really cool, and it has solved a lot of problems that I had. My audio still needs a lot of work because I'm just not that good at it, but it solved a lot of problems. So one more device that I wound up picking up for Line Goes Up. Again, I knew I was going to be doing some like 2-camera stuff out on the street. I have in the past rented like wireless lav packs. And in this case, I decided not to do that because a wireless lav pack still needs to like interface with the camera in some way. You know, so you've got the wireless unit on the Performer, you've then got the receiver unit on the camera, and then the receiver goes into, you know, the sound recorder, or, you know, loops through to the camera in some way. And I'm like, you know, I just don't want to deal with that. That's that much more in terms of like devices to manage. It makes the rig heavier. It makes it more unwieldy. It's more batteries that you need to worry about having supply of and being charged. And so I opted instead to go out and pick up a Zoom F2 field recorder. In terms of bang for buck, I was a little bit underwhelmed by this at first, but it has quickly become a tool that I am really glad that I have in my kit. It is in fact pretty good. So it's a 32-bit float audio recorder that comes with a fairly decent lav mic. The with it's got a clip that I just don't have here at the moment. This thing has some problems. The main problem that I learned, okay, so while we were out in New York recording Line Goes Up, I had this thing with me, so I was like wired up for it. And then I was using it as I was like going around to just record like random audio bits that we would come across. And we came across, so I say me, Crystal, and Big Joel were we're on Wall Street. We were at the Bull and we were walking past the New York Stock Exchange when we noticed there was like a press conference getting ready to happen. And it was the sculptor of I suddenly can't remember the name of it. So it's that bronze statue of the little girl that had been placed opposing the Wall Street Bull back during Occupy Wall Street or shortly thereafter. I don't remember the dates, but so it has since been like moved so that she's like staring at the stock exchange itself. And so the sculptor was doing this press conference that was all about a lawsuit that she had against like the Wall Street Commission, like basically the people who manage the actual like street itself, the appearance of the street, the statues that are on the street, all of like that stuff. That there was some like lawsuit involving the rights to the statue and her rights as it related to it. And I'm really hazy on the details at the time, but the thing that really caught my attention was that she was also simultaneously announcing an NFT collection. So I interviewed her and I discovered that the arming time on this thing is deceptive. And it didn't record any of it because I had quickly flipped it on and pressed record and I wasn't paying attention. And it turns out that this thing takes like 5 seconds to actually arm after you turn the power on. And if you don't wait long enough, it doesn't start recording. And I hadn't noticed that. And I lost all the audio.
Yeah, I'm just trying to shut it off right.
But aside from that, it's a really good device, and I've used it a whole bunch ever since. All of my outdoor stuff, or most of my outdoor stuff, since has been that I've used it. I've used it a bunch of times. It's really good. The one thing to really pay attention to is don't store it with batteries in it because it will slowly drain them. So just take the batteries out. And don't bother ever trying to get the card out. If you put a micro SD card in this, never try to get it out. It's a futile effort. Just plug it into the computer using USB-C and it'll mount. But don't bother trying to actually get the card out. But this has been a good little device. I'm glad I picked this one up. So then my current set of lights I picked up kind of right before shooting the metaverse video. And that's a pair, they're in use right now. A pair of Aperture Nova P300C. So these are RGB, so they're LEDs, they're RGB, and they've got this control box. They've got this control box as part of them, so you can, put it on a long remote. So even if the light's suspended up where you can't reach it, you can control it. So I can do, what was that at?
So RGB functions, I've got a whole bunch of presets on here. And then, of course, everything that you would expect in terms of so they're obviously very flexible. You can do a lot of really tacky things with them. I've been trying to use them in subtle ways. I've used them a few times for things, but I've used the special effects a few times for things. I'm trying to use them in a little bit more subtle ways. But obviously, you can do kind of crazy stuff with them. I'm enjoying, having sort of this splash of color. I've used it a few times. I will likely get bored of it very quickly, because that is one of the main things that I have learned about myself in gear, is that I do get bored. A lot of the things that I've bought over the years, kind of just came down to that I am, photography, videography, cameras and stuff has been as much a hobby for me as it has been a profession. And so there are certain things that I pick up purely because they solve a problem that I have. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff that I get because I want it. And these have sort of fallen, I guess, halfway in between, in terms of, I did go to a bunch of other working professionals. It's hey, here's what I need. I want to modernize my lighting setup. I've had a little bit of a windfall. What would you get if you were, you needed kind of soft studio lights that had some kick to them, but they weren't big, giant, bulbous soft lights. They need to work in a relatively confined space. What would you use? And this is what was recommended. The big downside, and it is a big downside, they are quite heavy. They are a lot heavier than I really anticipated, and so I did need to get significantly heavier stands for them than I already had. And that part, I would complain about a lot more if I needed to move them more. But it is a definite downside that I would keep in mind if I were going back in time to warn past Dan. But past Dan definitely he needed a long-term solution. He needed something modern that wasn't just cheap, wasn't just going to kind of fall apart after a year or two. So I think that's all of the lights. No, I'm not cutting to the song.